War can never break free from the magical spectacle, because its very purpose is to produce that spectacle. Paul Virilio makes a very firm statement here, which puts a lot of emphasis on spectacle and how closely we tie this idea to war. Before we can really dive into the role played by spectacle in the representation of conflict, it is vital we define this term, as already there is something quite strange about Virilio's use of the word magical to describe spectacle. The word would have originally been used in correlation with theatre and the act of performance. However, now, especially in relation to the war, spectacle has become a much more unstable word, most often used to describe a striking, often large-scale event. Anastasia Bacogiani gives interesting insights into different notions of spectacle, but I think one that will prove most useful when thinking about conflict is that spectacle today suggests an excessive, overblown, superficial event geared towards the mass consumer market. This is not necessarily a definition I would use as a base reference in this video, but it gives us a good insight into the general consensus surrounding ideas of spectacle and conflict that I want to deconstruct in this video. I particularly want to touch on the idea that although large-scale battles and explosions prevalent in conflict and war are bound to be reproduced in visual media, the way they choose to be reproduced can often vary from the common exploitative and performative spectacle we see in popular mainstream films, and in that sense, there is a great nuance to how spectacle can be approached in visual media. Before I begin to delve into the two main case studies, I want to take a brief detour to talk about Jordan Peele's latest psychological horror, Nope. The film has a unique relationship to spectacle that underlines a certain tendency that most of us exhibit to be drawn to spectacle, even if it may involve horrific imagery. We see one of the main characters, Ricky, use a previous traumatic experience that he had been through as a child to create his own museum, celebrating an event perceived by the general public as horrific. However, this museum is relatively tame compared to the main horror of this film, a creature that becomes an attraction curated by Ricky, which audiences choose to witness firsthand. However, those who stare directly at the creature are sucked in, consumed by the entity. In an analysis of this film's relationship with spectacle, Thomas Flight makes a very interesting point that the power of traumatic images can be avoided by not looking at them. But if we don't look, how do we know it's real? How do we prove to the world that it happened? There is a duty, almost, of visual representations of conflict to document spectacle. But even if the intention of these reproductions is to show the mass destruction of war, the Hollywood format used may have the opposite effect, giving audiences entertaining, action-packed sequences. I want to really question whether spectacle is perhaps taking away from how brutal and horrific scenes of war can be by presenting them as this grand spectacular event, by looking at films that actively defy these tendencies and use spectacle to their full advantage in order to truly capture the horrors of conflict and war. The first film I want to take a look at in regards to spectacle is a film called Come and See. One of the most revered anti-war films ever made. It's a piece that takes a very visceral approach to how it presents its spectacle. Cold, desolate rural landscapes are destroyed by bombs, and small villages are pillaged and burnt to the ground with no regard for those who inhabit them. The scale of these sequences lends them to spectacle. They are visually striking reenactments of the scenes that populated World War II. The content of these scenes may go further than what we come to expect from scenes of war, but what really makes these images effective in being shocking and horrific is in large part the eerie and greatly unsettling sound design that populates these scenes. Ear-piercing screams reverberate through most of the larger scale sequences in this film. In most war films, one of the most dominating sounds of spectacle is the sound of machinery, artillery, explosions that drown out the screams. Visually, it's natural that the main spectacle would come from the machines that cause destruction on a massive scale. However, it is often the sound design and choice of music that really predicates the tone of spectacle in representations of conflict. As Robert Bussmann points out, many films have been made about the senselessness and brutality of war, but they usually fail in their mission because, as François Truffaut pointed out, they transform war into excitement, and thus into entertainment. If we are to consider that spectacle is an inevitable part of the conflict, and consequentially representations of said conflict, we have to question here the importance of how spectacle is chosen to be represented, because as we can see and Come and See, there are certainly ways of showing spectacle without exploiting it. If we return to Bacogiani's definition of spectacle, it becomes clear why a film like Klimov's is unlikely to be made in today's mediascape. Perspective. If we consider who is making these films, more often than not, it is people who are somewhat disconnected from the conflict they are representing. Although these directors would have done their research into the chosen conflict, there's always going to be a certain disconnect between the superficial reproduction and the real event. To most audiences who are viewing the film through the same unknowing eyes as the director, though, this doesn't matter, as we will take this reproduction as the closest thing to the real spectacle we can get. What happens then when you get a director who has experienced the horrors of war?
Мальчиком, естественно, я был и видел и вот эти бомбежки, и когда уже мы переправлялись через Волгу,
Klimov's close
бежали на
relationship with
Урал.
the content of his film is what helps create the more visceral tone of the horror, making some scenes almost akin to documentary footage. Perhaps beyond the director's perspective, though, is the idea of who in the film is witnessing that spectacle. Giving a child's perspective of conflict adds on a certain innocence that makes the witnessing of horrific spectacle that much more intense, as we watch Floria become transformed by what he is forced to witness. In Come and See, we see the war through the victim's eyes, but rarely will we be presented with an objective perspective from the perpetrators of conflict. This, however, is precisely what Joshua Oppenheimer's 2012 documentary The Act of Killing wants to explore. Inviting real members of the Indonesian death squads that contributed in killing over 1 million suspected members of the Communist Party in the 60s to reenact their executions as Hollywood spectacle. More than anything, this documentary is a testament to the nullification of Hollywood spectacle, in the sense that so many grand battle sequences are so codified to the point where mainstream audiences no longer consider the context of the battles, as the action on scene would feel so similar to action in other war or blockbuster films that you could hardly tell them apart. The reenacted sequences of the horrors these men perpetrated becomes much more affective because we know this is how these men actively perceive themselves, and this is how they want to be perceived. And yet, we can find many similarities between these reenactments and the spectacle we find in major war media. Take these two sequences from Come and See and The Act of Killing. Particularly with The Act of Killing, there is a strange blend of heroism and horror as we watch the perpetrators proudly torture innocent civilians. Cher Alexander remarks that, as viewers of the film, we hardly believe our eyes when the perpetrators represent their past in ways that are variously heroic and spiritual, but always surreal. This comment, of course, stems from the fact that we are aware of who is actually reenacting these scenes, but if we were unaware of this fact, we wouldn't at all have the same relationship with them. I think the perpetrators' depictions of their past as heroic is natural, as this is the image of war that they know from Hollywood movies. The only difference here being that they portray themselves as the heroic soldiers fighting for their country, despite showing themselves reenacting atrocities. Then again, films like Apocalypse Now similarly show heroic figures committing horrific acts of violence. This precedent set by Hollywood of what spectacle should look like, particularly in post-World War II films, has remained in almost every depiction of modern conflict for over 70 years now. Even if films like The Act of Killing or Come and See actively distort our standard image of spectacle in war, as Valerie Hope notes when discussing war spectacle, they work by representing human conflict, death and destruction as something that is impressive and satisfying to look at. Even if they may elicit a specific reaction from us, this statement still holds in regards to the artistic freedom both films take in representing spectacle. I think because of this precedent of prioritizing spectacle and representations of conflict set by post-war Hollywood, the real spectacle of war has practically been mythologized, as almost everyone, even active perpetrators in conflict, have transformed it into this fictional spectacle created through the subjective lens of the camera.